we do want to talk about what the real meaning of social justice is, because that is, kind of the buzz phrase, I guess, that is the rallying cry for so many in our culture today. So, uh, I do want to admit something first, though, and it's not always easy to talk about, and maybe you share this struggle with me, but it's a real struggle. And just full disclosure, if there are any M&Ms in my house, I cannot stop eating them. Now, it really it's all or nothing. I could go for months without eating a single M&M, but if I have one, you might as well say goodbye to the whole bag. There's simply no moderation to be had. Now, my wife, on the other hand, she could have one of those little tiny single packets of M&Ms they give out at Halloween or something. She could eat on that same bag for a month. And I'm not exaggerating. She really could. And that's like, one handful for me. So it's really not fair. But what does my problem with M&Ms have to do with the real meaning of social justice? Well, it may seem like a very silly comparison, but essentially our culture has a moderation problem. We have the dangerous tendency to think in extremes. And I think this is evidenced by the redefinition of social justice that's occurred over the last several decades. So let me explain, and in order to do that, we'll actually kind of start with the punchline of all of this. So, properly understood and classically understood, justice refers to the right ordering of society and giving someone their due. In fact, justice is considered one of the cardinal virtues. Now, I certainly did not plan this with Mr. Woodson beforehand, but he mentioned virtue quite often, and I love that quote from, I think it was Thomas Jefferson, that he mentioned. So, what is a virtue? Well, we've talked about that, like I said already, in our time together. Well, other than being something that I think is very much lacking in our society, generally speaking, a virtue is a good habit that directs us to knowing and doing the good. Now, obviously, I think M&Ms are good. You may hate them. I don't know. So is that all we mean by good? What our personal preferences are? Well, if that's the case, then how can we escape from drowning in a sea of subjectivity and moral relativism, which we find ourselves in quite often in this culture? So again, we need to define some terms. So classically understood, good is that which fulfills the end or the purpose of something according to what that thing is. That is, according to that thing's nature. So just using an M&M as a silly example, a good M&M would be the one that's not melted. They melt in your mouth and not in your hand, right? It has the right amount of chocolate and candy coating according to the design of an M&M. And preferably, it doesn't contain any poisonous substances. But that is certainly not moral goodness in the sense that social justice would entail. So moral goodness enters the picture because as rational social beings, humans are able to know the nature of things and the ends or purposes towards which those things are directed. More specifically, we're able to know the ends towards which we are directed as human beings. So, for example, we know that our lungs are directed towards taking in oxygen and oxygenating our blood rather than taking in paint thinner or something to that effect. And more than just knowing this, as human beings, we are capable of choosing to seek to fulfill those ends, to seek to pursue the good, or to act contrary to the good. Now, this is known as natural law. It's where the good we ought to pursue is determined by our nature as human beings. So I like how philosopher Edward Feser puts it. He says this. He says, human beings have various natural capacities and faculties with objective purposes or ends, the realization of which constitutes the good for man. The content of our moral obligations is defined in terms of these ends and comprises, the natural law. Natural rights, in turn, are grounded in the natural law as safeguards of our ability to fulfill our moral obligations and realize our natural ends. It follows that anything which tends to frustrate our ability to fulfill those obligations and realize those ends violates our rights and amounts to an injustice. Now, I truly believe natural law is biblical. I think it is the law written on the heart of which Romans 2 speaks. And I also think it gives context to the moral commands laid out in the Bible. In other words, why does God say what he says about our sexual behavior or whatever the case may be? Well, as the author of our nature, he has given us those ends towards which our natures are directed. So he can only ever will what is good for us, which is why he commands what he does. And natural law also provides a solid foundation from which we're able to make moral judgments in the public sphere with both believers and unbelievers. So we're not left with simply just saying, well, the Bible says, to someone who doesn't care what the Bible says. They may not see it as an authority. And this is the moral theory that undergirded much of the civil rights movement that we heard about earlier. In fact, it is the natural law, according to St. Thomas Aquinas, to which Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. makes reference in his letter from Birmingham jail. So, putting all these things together, we see that the good for us is determined by the ends set forth according to our natures as human beings. A virtue is a habit that inclines us to know and to do the good, and the virtue of justice specifically is the right ordering of society according to the goods laid forth by natural law. So here's the thing about virtues, however. For every virtue, there is almost always a corresponding vice of excess or deficiency. In other words, it's easy to go to the extremes of either too little or too much and miss the virtue altogether. So basically, in our current culture, there's no moderation if there are M&Ms in the house. And this lack of moderation and sober judgment indicates that by and large, our culture has a shortage of virtue, just as Mr. Woodson was talking about. So I think we can better understand this problem of virtue and vice as it relates specifically to social justice by examining the right ordering of three key components of society: family, fellowship, and freedom. And let me say at the outset, I'm very much indebted to Dr. Fazer for his formulation of much of this. So I actually asked him to speak about this as well, but he wasn't available. So thank you, Dr. Fazer, if you ever see this, for your work in this area. So the family, rather than the individual, is the foundational building block of any society. And this is so because given our natures as human beings, we are naturally dependent for much of our lives on the care of a mother and a father. And most families naturally have a number of children. And vice versa, again, naturally speaking, as parents age, they then become in need of care from their adult children. So all of this taken together makes the family unit the first and the most natural expression of our social natures. Now, of course, nuclear families give rise to extended families, which give rise to larger communities, which ultimately give rise to cities, states, and nations. So all things being equal, of course, we're not looking at individual specific circumstances. We are speaking in generalities here. All things being equal, we have the deepest natural obligations to care for those within our immediate family. But like ripples on a pond, these obligations are then extended out to a lesser degree to those within our extended family, our community, our nation, and ultimately to others around the world. Now, Fazer points this out. He says, patriotism, or loyalty to your own country, is thus natural and good. just as family loyalty is natural and good. And he makes the point that I think is a very good point, that patriotism no more entails willing evils for other nations any more than loving your own family means that you're willing evil for your next door neighbor. That is not the case at all. So when the idea of family is disordered, we see two opposite extremes, two opposite vices. First, and this is something we hear a lot about these days, is the vice of excess in this particular area of family, known as nationalism. Yeah, of course, usually it has the word white before it, in our media at least. Now, this is the vice of thinking that one's own country or one's own ethnic group is the only one that matters, the only one that is important, and that other countries or groups can be mistreated in order to benefit your own. Now, obviously, such a view is disordered, given that even though we don't owe other countries as much as we owe our own, as members of the human race writ large, we do owe them something as we're able. So, given natural law, unjustly mistreating or harming anyone, we're not talking about just war theory and all that sort of stuff. We're just talking about just unjustly mistreating or harming anyone is immoral, since we all share a common human nature and thus the same natural rights that we mentioned earlier. Now, nationalism should not be confused with patriotism, however. Remember the ripples on the pond. So, all things being equal, we do have more responsibility to our own families and our own nation than to others. But again, that does not mean that we have no responsibility to others. You don't have to think in those extremes. There is a middle ground. So, by way of deficiency in the ordering of family is the vice of globalism. Now, this is the thinking too little of one's patriotic and familial obligations. Such thinking is both immoral and irresponsible. It also has the tendency to regard the nuclear family as optional or even arbitrary. For example, before they changed their website after this became very widely known several months ago, the Black Lives Matter organization website stated, quote, "We disrupt the Western prescribed nuclear family structure requirement by supporting each other as extended families and villages that collectively care for one another, especially our children, to the degree that mothers, parents, and children are comfortable." Now, that may sound good on the surface, but weakening families will only ever weaken a society as a whole. So, both the extremes of nationalism and globalism are contrary to the objective good laid forth in the natural law. And any culture promoting these extremes is disordered and cannot be considered just in regards to the proper ordering of family and societal responsibilities. So if the family is where our social nature is first practiced, then society as a whole is where our social nature, easy for me to say, is perfected. Now, this is where the idea of fellowship comes in. And by fellowship, I don't mean simply socializing over a potluck dinner or catching a movie with your friends. Rather, there's a much deeper idea at play here. So think of something like the Fellowship of the Ring from The Lord of the Rings, for example. That is a very specific use of fellowship where all the parts were working for the greater good of the whole. So this is the notion where the various aspects of society are all working together for the common good. And actually, Phaser points to the words of the Apostle Paul when he uses the example of a human body and its various parts all performing different functions for the sake of the whole organism. So Paul says this in 1 Corinthians 12, 20 through 26, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. He says, "But now there are many parts, but one body. And the eye cannot say to the hand, 'I have no need of you,' or again the head to the feet, 'I have no need of you.' On the contrary, it is much truer that the parts of the body which seem to be weaker are necessary. And those parts of the body which we consider less honorable, on these we bestow greater honor. And our less presentable parts become much more presentable, whereas our more presentable parts have no need of it. But God has so composed the body, giving more abundant honor to that part which lacked, so that there may be no division in the body, and that the parts may have the same care for one another. And if one part of the body suffers, all the parts suffer with it. If a part is honored, all the parts rejoice with it. Product placement, one moment. Thank you. So, first, notice that the only reason this illustration works is because we are naturally able to know the ends towards which our various faculties are directed, which is the foundation of natural law, which we talked about just a minute ago. Secondly, understanding in this way the individual parts of society as they relate to the whole negates the notions of class warfare and racial warfare. We're all part of one body performing individual but important roles for the sake of the whole and for the common good. Without this, society would completely fall apart. The family would weaken, and ultimately, the individual himself would suffer. So, the two vices related to the idea of fellowship are totalitarianism and equality or equity. I see those words used interchangeably. I know some people mean very specific things by each one, but it's very hard to find a consistent meaning. So I'll just use them interchangeably here, and hopefully you'll get the idea. So totalitarianism is the excess of putting too much emphasis on the whole of society at the expense of the parts. So communism, for example, would fall on this sword. The parts lose all individuality and importance. They essentially become cogs in a machine. They're interchangeable. Their individuality is irrelevant. Now, no organism can flourish if its parts are treated in this kind of way. So, by contrast, the vice of deficiency is equality or equity, depending on who's using the term. And we probably hear more about this than almost anything else today. It seems like equality or equity is constantly in the conversation in terms of social justice. But rather than being concerned with treating all people equally with equal opportunity for success, this vice expects and even demands equal outcomes and equal recognition. In a very kind of lighthearted example, you can think in terms of the baseball league where everybody gets a trophy, win or lose. So, for example, in their book Critical Race Theory and Introduction, Richard Delgado and Jean Stefanisic, I'm probably mispronouncing that name, I apologize. They write this: in the U.S. system, at least, rights are almost always procedural rather than substantive. Think how that system applauds affording everyone equality of opportunity, but resists programs that assure equality of results. Now, they're saying this is a bad thing, that the U.S. system does not assure equality of results. Now, aside from the pragmatic point of the fact that no one can engineer a system to assure equality of results, this thinking runs completely contrary to the reality we read about from Paul. Equity demands that everyone wanting to be an eye be treated as an eye, but not everyone is an eye. And if everyone were an eye, then who would do the walking? Who would do the thinking? Who would do the talking? Who would do the hearing? All of those sorts of things. Phaser puts it this way. He says, in the name of equal concern for all, it resists or even rejects the idea that different members of society have different roles, aptitudes, and needs. Hence, socialism's hostility to the very existence of different classes. Hence, feminism's hostility to traditional sex roles within the family. He goes on to say, hence the liberals' dogmatic insistence on seeing persistent differences in economic and other outcomes as a result of unjust discrimination and insufficiently vigorous social engineering. Of course, any kind of such social engineering would run contrary to the idea of fellowship as it relates to our natural states as humans living and working together as social beings with different talents, different interests, different stations in life, but we still obviously hold important equal possibilities and equal opportunities. So again, we see this echoed in the pages of Scripture. Ephesians 4:11 through 16 says this. Excuse me, speaking of Jesus, he says, "And he gave some as apostles, some as prophets, some as evangelists, some as pastors and teachers, for the equipping of the saints for the work of ministry, for the building up of the body of Christ, until we all attain to the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, to a mature man, to the measure of the stature which belongs to the fullness of Christ. As a result, we are no longer to be children, tossed here and there by waves and carried about by every wind of doctrine, by the trickery of people, by craftiness and deceitful scheming, but speaking the truth in love. We are to grow up in all aspects into him who is the head, that is Christ, from whom the whole body, being fitted and held together by what every joint supplies, according to the proper working of each individual part, causes the growth of the body for the building up of itself in love." Any society that promotes anything contrary is objectively disordered and necessarily unjust. So, lastly, families and the societies they create can't flourish without the freedom to do so. So think about it this way. I am a total germaphobe. I will admit it. Everybody who knows me knows that about me. And so me and one of my other friends like to say, we were made for COVID. We've been preparing for this day our whole lives. So we were already using hand sanitizer and all that sort of stuff. But I could protect my kids from COVID or from any other germs or whatever by simply keeping them locked in their room all the time. But of course, they would not flourish as human beings if I did that. Now, at the same time, I would be negligent if I let them go play in the middle of the street with no concern for their safety and where their cars were coming. Again, we need moderation when M&Ms are in the house. So individual families and other societal organizations like churches, charities, and those sorts of organizations have more intimate knowledge and vested interest in how best to care and support those in their charge. So as we saw earlier, there is also a hierarchy of responsibility from immediate families to extended families to local communities and so on. Yes, there is a certain level of government help, safety net, so to speak, that must be in place. But as much as possible, this notion of freedom within natural law, and technically it's known as subsidiarity, which we'll hear that word in just a minute. But this principle within the natural law understanding of the good and right ordering of society says that government should leave families alone and leave local organizations alone as much as possible. The government's job is to protect natural rights, not to give them, not to take them away. Now, this is not a commentary on whether you should or should not get the COVID vaccine, whether masks are a good idea, or any of that. We're speaking in general terms, and it takes wisdom and prudence to apply these general ideas to specific individual situations, which is not the point of our time together right now. So I just want to make that clear. But again, I quote Phaser. He observes, like the organic conception of society enshrined in the principle of solidarity or of fellowship, the principle of subsidiarity or freedom to pursue the good is at odds with socialism and any other political program that would, in the name of social justice, quote unquote, usurp what private enterprise, local communities, churches, and in general what Edmund Burke famously called the little platoons of society can accomplish. Now, on the other hand, there's a more telling example of carrying, there is no more telling example of carrying a misunderstanding of freedom to the extreme than the Supreme Court case of Planned Parenthood versus Casey. Now, perhaps you've heard this quote before. Justice Anthony Kennedy said in that case, "At the heart of liberty or freedom is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life." I'm going to read that again. At the heart of liberty, or freedom as we're talking about, is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life. Yes, a Supreme Court justice said that. Now, other than the fact that it's completely self-defeating, it is extremely dangerous. So rather than properly understanding freedom as the freedom to pursue the goods towards which we're directed by nature, by our human natures, freedom is now largely understood as freedom from constraints to think and do as we happen to please. Very few ideas have led to more chaos in our society. So we've reached the point of desiring to be free from reality altogether. Sex is no longer directed towards commitment and family and childbearing. Abortion on demand and no-fault divorce have made sure of that. Don't tell me whom I should love. Don't tell me what gender I am. Don't tell me that my beliefs don't correspond to reality. It's my reality. How dare you? At least that's what Justice Kennedy said. Now, of course, because such thinking is contrary to the good towards which we're directed as human beings, it can only ever lead to slavery rather than freedom. We become self-absorbed and slaves to our passions, to our desires, to every new fad, to whatever whim I happen to have that day, to our feelings, our emotions, all of those things, which results in the lack of proper fellowship and cooperation with others. Now, this lack of fellowship ultimately leads to the corruption of the family unit itself. And such corruption leads to more individual dependence on the government, and such dependence undermines true freedom and natural rights. So it's this complete circle of disorder, and it is anything but just, but it is exactly where our culture finds itself today. So as we think about the virtue of social justice, we must remember that moderation is key to avoiding the destructive extremes that we've discussed. I need to learn to not go overboard on the M&Ms, and I think my wife needs to learn to enjoy them a little bit more personally. But as a society, we need to learn to stop thinking in extremes and to embrace, in this case, the virtue of justice. Now, I love this quote from Phaser that I just really think captures the irony of the situation. He says, the currency of the term social justice originated in Thomistic natural law social theory, which is what we've been talking about. It has to do with the just or right ordering of society as defined by strong families and cooperation between husband and wife in carrying out their respective roles for the sake of children and elders. Solidarity, or fellowship, and cooperation between economic classes and other social groups, and scrupulous attention to subsidiarity, or again, freedom to pursue the good, in the state's relationship to the little platoons of society. What today goes under the label of social justice, what self-described social justice warriors agitate for, is precisely the opposite of all of this. Any culture that promotes things contrary to natural law, which ultimately would be contrary to biblical teaching as well, cannot be just. The fact is, it is the very same natural law morality that gives us the tools with which to fight true social injustice wherever it occurs. This is why racism, for example, is always wrong, and we should fight it wherever we find it. But it is also why attempting to combat racism with ideas like critical race theory or modern ideas of social justice are both vicious and completely and utterly bankrupt. Now, I'm passionate about this issue for a number of reasons that we're not going to get into right now. But not the least of these reasons is the fact that people are walking away from the truthfulness of historic Christianity because they've bought into this misguided notion of social justice. They think that biblical historic Christianity is bigoted It's narrow-minded, it's intolerant, it's hateful, whatever word you want to throw in there. And they think that anyone who disagrees with them can't do so out of good motives. They necessarily think, or they think these people that disagree with them necessarily must be unloving and immoral, essentially. But they're simply wrong. And we must be equipped to share truth with them. So we've talked about the virtue of justice, but let me mention one other virtue, and that is the virtue of love. And love has been completely redefined in our culture as well. Love is now defined in terms of freedom from anything, so that if I love you, then I have to affirm whatever belief, desire, or behavior you happen to have or engage in. But that is not at all what love means. Love means to will the good of another. We've talked about what the good is. And to will the good of another is when I truly love them. Now, part of willing the good for others means telling them the truth. Now, obviously, we do this as best as we can and through the power of the Holy Spirit with gentleness and respect. I hope that goes without saying. But simply disagreeing with someone does not mean you don't love that person. And that's what our culture thinks. I'm glad that's not the case, because you can ask my kids, I disagree with them a lot, but I love them more than almost anything other than my wife and God. But it's because I love them that I disagree with them. And we have to tell them the truth. The truth is the only thing that will awaken people from their blindness of their wokeism and these corrupt ideas of social justice. Our Christian convictions, undergirded by classical natural law reasoning that we've talked about this, right now, compel us to fight real racism wherever it is found and to stand for truth corresponding to reality, justice, the right ordering of society, natural rights that we've mentioned already, and true freedom that these natural rights secure. And that's why Southern Evangelical Seminary is committed to equipping students with the philosophical and the theological tools necessary to engage these cultural issues head on. It's not always fun, it's not always easy, but it is necessary. And as we've seen, the current popular understanding of social justice is the opposite of the good all humans should pursue, and that is anything but just. As I've said before, and as we've said in the advertisements for this event, we cannot love our neighbors well and lead them to the gospel if we sacrifice truth and goodness on the false altar of wokeness ideology. Now, the ultimate truth is, apart from the gospel, apart from a restored relationship with God through trusting in the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, we have no ultimate hope in this life. So I want to leave you with the words of Paul from Ephesians 4:17 through 25. So I say this and affirm in the Lord, that you are to no longer walk just as the Gentiles also walk, in the futility of their minds, being darkened in their understanding, excluded from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them, because of the hardness of their heart. And they, having become callous, have given themselves up to indecent behavior for the practice of every kind of impurity with greediness. But you did not learn Christ in this way, if indeed you have heard him and have been taught in him, just as truth is in Jesus, that in reference to your former way of life, you are to rid yourselves of the old self, which is being corrupted in accordance with the lusts of deceit, and that you are to be renewed in the spirit of your minds, and to put on the new self, which in the likeness of God has been created in righteousness and holiness of the truth. Therefore, ridding yourselves of falsehood, speak truth, each one of you with his neighbor, because we are parts of one another.
Providing an integrated, apologetics-focused Christian education that will equip you to remain steadfast in the truth. That's SES.